Hi. On behalf of RIKK, the Institute for Gender, Equality and Difference at the University of Iceland, I want to welcome you to the 7th lecture in the Spring 2023 lecture series on decolonization. Today's lecture is titled Challenging Coloniality in Higher Education, the Experiences and Perspectives of Students. My name is Flora and I'm a PhD student at the School of Education, and I will be moderating today's session. Today's lecturer is Sue Gollifer, lecturer at the Department of International Studies of Education at the University of Iceland. Sue holds a doctorate in human rights education from the University of Iceland. Her research areas include human rights education as a transformative pedagogy to develop social and ecological well-being, relational approaches in teacher education, and the internationalization of higher education in the context of increasing student diversity. Before I give the floor to the lecturer, I want to mention that after the lecture we will have time for questions from the audience. Sue, if you would like to start.
Thank you very much, Flora, and also thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to come here today. And I hope that after I've presented some of the ideas that I'm working with at the moment, we can have an interesting discussion. But I want to first, I want to first contextualize my study in relation to the RIKK lectures on decolonialism. And this call for papers included a statement about decolonization and post-colonial studies show how the lingering effects of colonialism continue to promote silencing and distortion, perpetuate social inequality, weaken democracy, and reduce equality. Now, at the macro level, we're all familiar with the impact of this lingering effect of colonialism in the context of increasing right-wing populism, racism, homophobia, and violence against women, in lived realities, but also evident in government policy and legislation that is discriminatory and represents a violation of human rights. At the macro level, we are all familiar, sorry, I'm getting a little bit nervous, so let me have a break and I'll start again. So this call for the lecture series and papers appeared on my screen after I'd been teaching a course called Comparative Education at the School of Education. And this particular course is organized in a way where the students have responsibility for leading the discussions on selected readings. And the topic on that particular day was internationalization of higher education, a cross-cultural perspective. I left the classroom that day overwhelmed with emotion because of the richness, the depth, and the level of criticality of the student exchanges taking place. And while part of this emotion can be explained in terms of optimism as regards the possibilities that students' perspectives offer a world characterized by increasing social inequality and threats to democracy, another part was of anger and frustration. Some of the experiences of being a student at this university reflected broader inequalities and undemocratic practices at the micro level, not at the macro level, but in the institution where I worked. And this disturbed and unsettled me. And it also challenged me to go further to understand my role as an educator in relation to discriminatory practices experienced by students in the Department of International Studies of Education where I work. So in my own work and teaching, my theoretical frame of reference has tended to draw more broadly on critical education theory in the context of social justice and human rights education, with an emphasis on critical pedagogy. Now, critical pedagogy and human rights have as their ultimate goal the pursuit of social justice and human well-being through educational processes involving individual and collective consciousness of oppressive contexts and human vulnerability. They also include legal and political knowledge of international obligations and commitments towards ensuring this well-being, and also they offer an action-oriented response to injustice. Now, both critical pedagogy and human rights education have been critiqued by decolonial scholars, critiques that need to be engaged with if these educative goals are to be achieved. Now, if we look at the point that Tuck and Wang illustrate, they talk about decolonization, which we assert as a distinct project from other civil and human rights-based social justice projects, is far too often subsumed into the directives of these projects, with no regard for how decolonization wants something different than those forms of justice. And this suggests that there are two important aspects of decolonization that pedagogical approaches, such as those that I work with, need to consider. First, that it evokes a historical narrative that resists Eurocentrism and acknowledges the contributions of colonized populations across the globe. And second, that it emphasizes a moral imperative for righting the wrongs of colonial domination and an ethical stance in relation to social justice for those peoples disempowered by persistent forms of coloniality. Can we see? Sorry, something has come up on my screen, so I'm just going, no, it's okay, it's fine. Yep, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, thank you. The point that I want to make is that decolonization can offer important pedagogical perspective for educators to work with relations of coloniality and the impact of these on the possibilities for individual and social transformation. Okay, yeah. So what we can't do is take for granted universal assumptions about human rights or emotions such as care, concern, sympathy or empathy leading towards solidarity and transformation without considering colonial histories and conditions. In the absence of these considerations, critical pedagogy and human rights education may serve colonizing and orientalizing functions for those who have been and still are systematically excluded from its imaginary. And for that reason, I needed to come up with a set of questions that I wanted to inform the work I'm doing around this topic. And these questions include, who is the human in human rights, and who constitutes the other, the non-human, who is excluded from its imaginary? What is the nature of the oppression taking place? We need to look at the complexities of oppression. In accounts of cultivating critical consciousness, who's being moved, who's being affected or transformed, and who is fixed in place? And to what extent does awareness of personal privilege and advantage move beyond being a pedagogic concern to a political project of decolonizing white colonial structures and practices, both within and beyond the education sectors? So colonial logic is a way of thinking, doing, and being as a result of colonization. It represents the dominant patterns of power and knowledge that underpin our societies today, and it's influenced by Euro-Western ontological, epistemological, and hermeneutical principles in religion, science, and philosophy, typically underpinned by white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. Decoloniality then can be understood as a process that challenges this colonial logic by making visible the invisible, by unmuting the muted. And it's an attempt to find new ways to combat the effects of taken for granted assumptions embedded in the global impact of Western imperialism, which also affects educational institutions such as the university. So decoloniality advocates for the disruption of legacies of racial, gender, and geopolitical inequalities and domination. I have two arguments that I want to present to you today. The first is that diverse student voices are integral to decolonization of higher education. Their diverse experiences provide content and contexts that can be used to raise awareness of dominant forms of knowledge, assumptions, rules, and practices in higher education. And this awareness can be used to challenge the transnational, transcontinental impact of colonial logic. My second argument is that the experiences of the students on the International Studies and Education program suggest that colonial logic plays a significant part in creating contexts of discomfort, which are manifested in discriminatory practices related to language and admission criteria here at the university. But first, I want to position myself in relation to what I'm going to talk about today. So my mother has Amerindian heritage from my grandmother, who is Warao, and from my grandfather, who is Arawak. And they live in Guyana, which was British Guyana, which became independent from Britain in 1966. And my father was 22 years old when he went to Hosorora to run the agricultural station there in 1957 as part of his job with the British Overseas Department of Technical Cooperation. Now, the picture you see here is the front cover of my sister's book. Anne is an artist, and the Guyana project began in 2012, and it's called Views in the Interior of Guyana. And her intention was to initiate a dialogue between her own work and that of Robert Schumbuk. So Schumbuk first published a book, also called Views in the Interior of Guyana, in 1840. And his book recorded the first expedition to British Guyana for geographical, ethnological, and botanical exploration on behalf of the Royal Geographical Society. And such was his success that the British government sent him back to British Guyana to secure provisional eastern and western boundaries with Venezuela and Suriname. He later helped arbitrate the southern boundary with Brazil, and Anne was born in 1960, 20 miles from the Schumbuk line between Venezuela and what is now known as Guyana. Her book is the same size as his book and adapts the same format as those in Schumbuk's book and includes handmade color lithographic copies of 12 paintings in watercolor that she did. Her aim was to discover her birthplace with adult eyes, reclaiming it, she writes, from fading memories and a colonial gaze. And there's a section in her book where she describes my mother's reflection on losing her mother tongue. Now I wish I'd learnt their languages, my mother's, my father's. Your grandfather was such a clever man. He spoke Warao, he spoke Arawak, he spoke Spanish and English. I only speak English. I was born in the Solomon Islands, where my father was stationed at that time, also a British protectorate. And at the age of 8, I was sent to a boarding school in England, a Catholic convent, the religion of my mother then and still today. And I was not conscious of being of mixed heritage or of being a foreigner whilst in school. But it was only when I was outside of school that I noticed that there was something about the way that I looked that invited unwelcome remarks. Britain in the late 70s and early 80s was moving away from its social, political, and cultural counter-revolution towards right-wing neoliberal ideologies. And experiences of racism, verbal and physical, against myself, other students, members of my family, were never addressed in school, and I never spoke about them at home. In fact, when at home in the Solomon Islands and later Botswana, I never felt insecure as regards as who I was or felt I had to explain where I came from. I moved to Cambodia in September 1993, where I was working on an in-service program for secondary English language teachers. Cambodia, a former French colony, was a country which was just in the processes of reconstruction. And amongst my Cambodian colleagues, I held a high status because of where I came from, where I had been educated, and why I was there, despite being a female in a highly patriarchal society. Yet their perception of me in relation to my white male and female colleagues placed me on a lower hierarchical status. As one female Cambodian colleague said to me, "You're brown and skinny like us. We respect you, but they have more power than you." In 2010, I moved to Iceland with my husband and daughter. I became a doctoral student, and I eventually started teaching at the University of Iceland. I had, in a sense, adopted this insider-outsider position in Iceland in that I felt settled with my family, and yet I was also often asked where I came from, and when I would respond, "I'm from the UK," I would be asked again, "No, where do you really come from?" And these intersections always reminded me that I was perceived as different, but different from what? What was this dominant norm that identified me as different? And this sense of belonging and not belonging in different cultural and geographical locations became an internalized part of my being. And I became aware of my own shifting identity and my status, depending on perceptions of what I represented in different geographical locations in terms of gender, whiteness, and status. And I also became aware of the power and privilege implications of how I was perceived in different cultural locations. And it is this awareness of shifting identities and othering as a result of assumptions about identity, whiteness, superior knowledge, and power based on dominant and ingrained notions of the accepted norm that informs the arguments that I want to present to you here today. The International Studies in Education program was an innovative and visionary response to the context in 2008, where access to higher education for students who had settled here in Iceland was very limited because courses were taught in Icelandic. The establishment of the International Studies in Education program can actually be traced back to the persistence of one individual, Hanna Ragnarsdóttir, who had an overview of the difficulties facing immigrants in teacher education. In this sense, its very history represents a decolonial response, in that it seeks to find new ways to combat the effects of taken for granted assumptions embedded in the global impact of Western imperialism and that have seeped into our education system as well. The program was a social justice response that sought to address educational inequalities through increased access for a growing migrant population in Iceland. Since 2008, there have been significant changes to the program. The program has now become a department housed under the Faculty of Education and Diversity. The teachers have become increasingly diverse in terms of ethnicity, and we have an increasingly diverse student body made up of international students, exchange students, Icelanders with immigrant backgrounds, and Icelanders with Icelandic heritage backgrounds. And our numbers have grown over the years. From 2008, when we started, there were 12 students. We now have over 60 students studying a BA or MA with us. And this doesn't include exchange students. So this is a significant part of the faculty where I work and of the university more broadly. And these students come from 26 countries. The majority are from Ghana. As a department, we've made a conscious effort to develop a critical approach to teaching and learning. Students are regularly put in the position of comparatively analyzing the educational systems in their country of origin in relation to the content in the different courses. So if we go back to my first argument, it was that diverse student voices are integral to decolonization of higher education. I want now to present to you 3 examples of the typical types of contexts and contents which I talk about and which I believe provide opportunities for decolonial pedagogy. These are examples that I have drawn from the lesson I left that I referred to at the beginning of this lecture, and also my teaching journal. So the first example is what I refer to as critiquing present education systems with a view to the past and possibilities in the future. Engaging in cross-cultural dialogues about education systems raises awareness of dominant forms of educational practice influenced by Western expectations and standards. And it also talks to us about what actually constitutes relevant knowledge and ways of teaching. This allows students to critique their own university system or their own previous education background in relation to colonial histories and construct new possibilities for themselves as regards how to engage with their studies in the future. An example is a discussion around being aware of the narrow perspectives that are offered in their own home institutions. And many of them talk about cross-cultural concerns are not a focus area. And they talk about teacher education in particular, where many of our exchange students are attending teacher education colleges. And one student talks about content and materials and being made aware, whilst in discussions with students from the course, how Eurocentric they are and how dominated they are by white male scholars. But then interestingly, students from other country contexts said, well, that's also the same in our home countries. So it's irrespective of where the educational institution is. Another example is the use of the colonial language as the language of instruction in ex-colonies. So the post-colonial legacy on the multiple mother tongues in some of these country contexts raises interesting questions and pedagogical opportunities about language as a possible tool of oppression and as a means of maintaining colonial control after decolonization. And so these contents and contexts provide an opportunity to build awareness of trying to find ways to live with diversity rather than to celebrate or manage diversity, which is my next example. So too often diversity in institutions is often described as something to celebrate or something to manage, creating different, really dangerous forms of othering based on perceptions of the diverse other as distinct from the dominant norm because of certain characteristics or traits. And this can lead to notions of the exotic foreigner on one hand, and the need to find ways to integrate the foreigner into the dominant culture on the other. And this typically is understood as a one-way process. The dialogues that take place among the International Study and Education Program students reflects a relational process in that there is no one dominant culture, but rather an opportunity to explore ways to facilitate communication in context of cultural diversity. A number of conversations raised refer to learning in diverse contexts being something that should not be understood as unproblematic or uncomplicated. The difference in learning styles and expectations, multiple forms of English and approaches to respecting time, for example, and how to engage in group work, was sometimes described in terms of being really painful and being frustrating and complicated, but ultimately rewarding if well facilitated by the teachers. The final example here is what I refer to as recognizing disadvantage as both common and particular to specific members of the group. So students refer to increased awareness of transnational and geopolitical influences on how higher education is organized and experienced. There was a lot of discussion about neoliberal tendencies of internationalization of higher education when emphasis is placed on attracting international students and faculty to boost rankings without considering their lived experiences within that institution. Many of the students were attracted to come here to Iceland because of the relatively low registration costs. Yet through this discussion, they became aware of the varying experiences amongst them in this context of internationalization of higher education. And the two main points that were raised were linked to language entrance requirements and a sense of belonging within the university setting, both socially and academically. Hidden costs of having to do IELTS and TOEFL tests, which is a proficiency language test, was of concern to certain students, especially those who came from countries where their whole education had been in English, and that's a point I'll come back to later. But in terms of academic and social exclusion, the class discussion always raised a really strong sense of how international study and education programs feel unwelcome when attending courses from other programs. Both those taught in English and Icelandic, where the majority of students are Icelanders. This sense of not being able to engage with Icelandic students outside of the university is also evident in students' attempts to take part in social events. Several students describe being told that, no, you can't join certain cultural activities in the university because you don't have a good grasp of Icelandic. And in another case, one student was told, based on his application to become part of an international committee, that because he didn't have a good grasp of Icelandic, it wouldn't make sense for him to be part of that committee. A common sentiment amongst students from the International Studies and Education program is that there's a lack of interest from Icelandic students about where they come from. Recognizing disadvantage as both common and particular to specific members of the group provides the context to discuss the essence or the reasons for this disadvantage, both in terms of university policy and practice, but also how these intersect to allow hegemonic forms of knowledge, assumptions, rules, and practices in higher education to persist. So this part of the lecture, what I've just discussed with you, aimed to illustrate the power of diverse student voices to make visible the invisible, to unmute the muted, as an attempt to find new pedagogical ways to combat the effects of taken for granted assumptions embedded in our institution. I wanted to show the importance of diverse student voices for decolonizing higher education. I'm now going to turn, I'm not going to turn there yet. This was to sum up what I was just been discussing, is that decolonial pedagogy is a trans and interdisciplinary approach. It's embedded in a continual resistance to colonial logic. It's praxis-driven, and it embraces pluriversal and intercultural knowledge creation. In this sense, and I think this is the important part for me, it is relational. It's not a one-way process. It requires engagement with diverse others in order to create pluriversal global perspectives, but also whilst being contextualized in the local. So now let's turn to the second argument that I wanted to work with, which is the International Study and Education Program students' experience suggests that colonial logic plays a significant part in creating contexts of discomfort, which are manifested in discriminatory practices related to language and admission criteria. Now, I use the term qualification coloniality to refer to assumptions about superior forms of knowledge and that fail to recognize the validity of knowledge acquired outside of the Eurocentric or perhaps even the Nordic-centric frame of reference. To contextualize the points about the proficiency and admission tests, this is what it says on the university's webpage. As all teaching is in, and this refers to admission to our program. As all teaching is in English, students must be able to communicate and hand in written assignments in English. The entry requirement for non-native speakers of English is a TOEFL score of 79 or an IELTS score of 6.5, which is a high score. I then went and looked at the country requirements and decided to focus on Ghana because that's where the larger proportion of our students come from. And it states proof of English proficiency must be provided. Having studied at a university in Ghana where the language of instruction was English does not fulfill the English proficiency requirements. What I did was that I then did a series of focus groups to follow up on some of these concerns that I was having based on listening to the students' voices. The discussion around the need for students to take an English proficiency course before being admitted to the university reflects, for the participants in this focus group, it reflects almost a sense of cynical wonder as regards why a university expects native speakers of English from Africa to do a proficiency English test to enter into a university that does not even use English as the main language of instruction and that makes it extremely difficult for students to use their English when enrolling in courses taught in Icelandic. As Paul points out here, and Paul came to the University of Iceland already with a master's and enrolled to do another master's, and he attended one of the best universities in his country. He says, I have certificates in topics like operations, management, logistics, and supply chain management, accounting, all that was carried out in English. And I still have to prove that I'm fluent in the language before I'm admitted into an Icelandic program, which also I find very funny, where traditionally the language of instruction is Icelandic. Paul and Petra point out that these tests are expensive and can be the equivalent to 4 months' salary in certain country contexts. Family members contribute to the cost in some instances, but passing these tests is not only dependent on language knowledge. Paul refers to cultural references in the tests that may be unfamiliar to students from certain African contexts. And he also talks about the validity of a test when the listening speed can actually mean that even though your comprehension is good, your grade is lower. He refers to these tests as priced as if the world is like a hegemonic monolithic society and based on broad assumptions about global economic realities. And as he says, it's so frustrating how globalization has kind of like put us into this same financial bracket where we all experience economies in very different ways. And even when students do pass these tests, there's no guarantee that they will get through the university application process, as Peter's accounts reveal. Peter talked about examples of students he knows being rejected during the application process. The first because the tertiary institute in the home country of the student was not recognized by the admissions officer. When the student sent back a letter to appeal the decision, her application was approved 72 hours later. In the second case, the applicant who was rejected was a top student at one of the best universities in the country, and a colleague at the university recommended that he write directly to the rector of the University of Iceland, which he did. He was then admitted. He has since left Iceland after securing a scholarship in Canada after finishing his university degree in Iceland with distinction. One of the participants shared a similar story when he was first rejected by the university. A relative living in Iceland queried the rejection, and he was told that it was because they had not received an email from the university stating that he had completed his degree. As he points out, without this connection in Iceland, he may not have followed this up himself. But the main point raised in these discussions was the feeling of frustration and the feeling of almost disbelief that a university would treat its applicants in such unprofessional ways, amounting to what Peter refers to as disrespect. Peter was shown the original rejection letter of the student, which he describes in the following way. They denied him admission. I was so sad. If any lawyer sees that letter, they would sue because it was so disrespectful. They stated that the university was not recognized. It was like they demeaned the university. And he goes on to say, maybe there are some misconceptions about certain groups of people. I don't know. At least take your time. Learn about other institutions, especially those in Africa and other developing countries. From a decolonial perspective, these examples can be discussed in terms of the concept of whiteness, a concept that can be connected not only to racism and skin color, but also to markers of inferiority and superiority, with the individuals who benefit taking their privilege for granted and thus normalizing what can be described as discriminatory acts based on its lack of logic and its harmful impact. It's often stated that Iceland has a recent immigrant history, setting it apart from other Western countries that have long histories of racial segregation. There is a risk that this view conceals the fact that discrimination is a complex and deeply rooted concern in Iceland. As Kristin Lofsdottir points out, it's common to celebrate certain forms of foreignness as contributions to the multicultural landscape, concealing institutionalized racism in particular when it coexists with a celebration of the consumer-oriented packaging of difference. Institutional racism is fueled by a political discourse. How long do I have? 10 more minutes, thank you. Institutional racism is fueled by a political discourse that defends nationalist interests for the sake of the perceived well-being of a society, which leads me to the second point under this argument, which I refer to as linguistic coloniality, which came out evidently in all the focus groups that I've taken so far. So by linguistic coloniality, I want to explain that this is not about a specific language. It's intended to describe how language can be used to create divisions and perpetuate notions of coloniality by creating contexts of othering. Linguistic coloniality refers to language being used to determine who has access to knowledge. Thus, it's about power and who has the control, which means that there will be those who will be disadvantaged based on the decisions being made. One of the main and persistent concerns raised by the students in the Department of International Studies is the lack of access to elective courses and opportunities to study for teacher certification because of language barriers. Experiences of students reveal the considerable power of teachers running the course who can agree or not agree to them enrolling in courses taught in Icelandic. In cases where teachers have allowed them to enroll, their experiences illustrate feelings of frustration, anger, and vulnerability. The examples that I use here are from students who want to become teachers and who already have a basic level of Icelandic. Daniel talks about being excluded from the class when working with the same students across 3 classes. He says, "No one talked to me." When he knew he was going to miss a class, he asked for a Facebook group to be set up or a contact email, because this is something, as he said, we do in the Department of International Studies. He knew there was a Facebook group for this class, but he was never invited to join, even when commenting to others that he knew that this Facebook group existed. He goes on to talk about an online breakout group discussion and the student leader asking everyone to comment except him and then abruptly ending the meeting. The cameras were all on, and he said the only evidence that he may not be Icelandic was his name. As he points out, he was not even asked in Icelandic, which he understands, and so the assumption was, you're a foreigner, you don't speak Icelandic, and there's no need for me to ask you to participate. His frustration is evident as he describes these events. The need to survive a BA degree. I mean, I should not have to survive when it comes to working on assignments. The academic part should be something challenging, but like me trying so hard to interact with people and not getting anything back. Anna talks about the need to fight and be tough-skinned when faced with hostility from teachers and students, which is her strategy. You have to fight to get it, no matter how you do it. I mean, I'm not even aiming for 7 or 8. 5. If I get 5, then okay. Next, verkefni. I know it's bad, but I have no other option. Maybe they have a fear of their language fading away, but I also understand that a little bit of support would encourage us to learn the language. Helena talks about students complaining to the teachers when they were put in a group with her, and this is something that other students in the Department of International Studies talk about. And of course, what this does, as we all know, it makes you feel inadequate. It makes you feel insecure, as she says, and you feel like you don't belong. It's so hard, so uncomfortable. We feel we're adjusting for them, and maybe it's our responsibility, but I feel like it's only us working. You feel bad because you can't speak or understand sometimes. We feel like we're dragging them down because we can't speak their language. But let me express myself in English, because this is how I can express myself. Helena dropped out of the teaching program and refers to other international students who have done the same. No teachers or staff have followed up about her dropping out. When asked how this situation could be addressed, all the students in the focus group referred to the role of the teacher in such scenarios to acknowledge the needs of students and to show that they care about who you are and to take you seriously. They felt that teachers are responsible for setting the expectation in the classroom as regards how to support and encourage learning despite limited Icelandic. As Petra points out, the international response suggests a power dynamic that positions the student without Icelandic as inferior to the student with Icelandic. As I said earlier, this isn't about the Icelandic language per se, but it's about choices being made within the institution and by those working in the institution, and what these choices suggest. From a decolonial perspective, we can again take the concept of whiteness to better understand what is happening here. And if we look at the policy, the Iceland language policy approved by the university, we can see that it reflects a form of privileging students and indeed teachers who can afford to forget their skin color and position of power and the language that is their dominant language. Ironically, the voices of the international study students are not asking teachers to change from Icelandic to English, but rather to first find ways to address language barriers that place certain students at a disadvantage in terms of access and participation during their studies. And second, to understand the richness that diversity in the student body brings to knowledge construction. As Boronsky and Hassan point out, students from the dominant culture who are not provided with the opportunity to engage in critical analysis of how they perceive the world are unable to make links between their perception of reality and social injustice. When monolingualism is presented as the norm, this can be reflective of a form of colonial logic. The 2021-2023 Equality Action Plan states as one of its aims, equality is one of the three central values of the strategy of the University of Iceland and a guiding principle of the university and the basis of diversity and respect in the academic environment. Two of the action points under teaching, learning and research include 1.2, support for immigrant students, and 1.3, teaching methods to meet the need of a diverse student population. Based on the voices of these students, these actions have not been achieved. The examples from the students indicate that teachers are not prepared or do not understand their role in terms of meeting the needs of a diverse student population. Administrative staff should also be responsible for guiding students rather than adopting the hands-off approach that a number of students have experienced, and as Petra's comment illustrated previously. And this makes me question then, where are the voices of such students within these action plans? How have their lived realities and experiences informed these actions? The plan ends in 2023. Lack of diverse perspectives in terms of policy responses allows forms of coloniality persist. The result is that Icelandic students will continue to find it challenging to work in relations with linguistically diverse others. Teachers will continue to not address the negative experiences of students, and these linguistically diverse others will continue to feel the need to fight, or will become despondent, bitter, and move on out of the country and take all their richness with them. Decoloniality as an epistemological frame requires delinking from colonial logic, such a logic that fails to question the negative impacts of monolanguage teaching on students who are not sufficiently proficient in the language to be able to participate. And my final slide, the concluding remarks, are just what I have learned in the development of this presentation today. So decolonial thinking reminds us that we need to read the learning context to identify injustice and to act on it. These injustices are not only taking place in the classroom, but in the broader institution. Too often, diversity is understood as a problem to be fixed through the development of courses and training materials, and so often by people who represent the dominant culture. This is a one-way process and definitely not one that encourages pluriversal knowledge and intercultural praxis. Instead, it seeks to manage the increasing diversity in society and contain cultural difference. Decolonizing is not easy work. It's unsettling, it's difficult, it definitely makes me nervous, and it's an unfinished, praxis-driven process. Answers to decolonial questions are derived from a web of consensual relations that is infused with movement through lived experiences and embodiment, as exemplified by the diverse voices of the students. And providing a relational space for students to take the lead in decolonizing processes can encourage pluralistic epistemologies and political action. It further challenges narrow understandings of decolonization within higher education, limited to celebrating or managing diversity without enacting fundamental changes, and which therefore allow coloniality to persist. And on that note, thank you very much.